Hello there, and welcome to our new venture. The Muscombe History Group channel moves us away from the lockdown specials and gives us a place to permanently store some of our general history programs. If you have any ideas or any preferences for content, make sure you let us know. This first story is The Misguided Path to Edgehill in 1642. The opening battle of the English Civil Wars. Or, how and where did the English Civil Wars start in the first place? The path to the English Civil War is here, on the A422 Banbury Road in Warwickshire. Just on the edge of the Cotswolds, about halfway between Stratford-on-Avon and Banbury. Charles I left London under pressure from Parliament and went into the north. Parliament held London and several other southern cities. This gave them access to significant military stores and weapons. Charles needed to gain access to similar stores of weapons. A large arsenal had been collected at Kingston upon Hull for the Second Bishops' War in 1638. But in January 1642, Sir John Hotham was ordered by Parliament to seize Hull and keep Charles out of the city. In April 1642, Charles arrived with his force, expecting to be welcomed into the city and build up his forces. The gates were closed, and Hotham refused to admit Charles. After a few days of laying siege, a very angry Charles set off to the south and west to gather arms and men elsewhere. Following Sir John Hotham's treasonous behaviour, Charles decided that war with Parliament was now inevitable. He marched down through Nottinghamshire and, in August of 1642, on a cold, wet and windy night, he raised his standard on the green in front of Nottingham Castle. After a few minutes, the standard was blown away by the gale. And after a few hours, Charles decided Nottingham was not a good place to recruit an army, and he moved on. Charles marched from Nottingham through Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Cheshire, Shropshire, gathering forces and weapons on the way. He stopped at Shrewsbury and waited for royalist supporters from Wales and the north. He ordered Prince Rupert to bring the royalist cavalry up from Oxford to join the king's army. At 22, Rupert was an experienced soldier, and he was the best cavalry commander in the whole of Britain. On his way, Rupert met a force of Parliamentary Dragoons. The Parliamentary Dragoons were under John Brown, and they advanced to the bridge over the River Tern. The vanguard pushed over Powick Bridge and formed a bridgehead, only to find Rupert's gentlemen in the field enclosures around Wick. Rupert's men immediately charged, and Brown's men fled the field. John Brown lost 150 men. Rupert's men retired into Worcestershire to join the king on his way towards London. In the meantime, Parliament had appointed Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex, to command the Parliamentary army. Essex led the army out of London to find Charles and his forces. The village of Edgehill still has commanding views across towards Kinnerton. The king was moving at a leisurely pace from Shrewsbury down into Worcester and across to Warwickshire, where he eventually camped on the ridgeway above the village of Radway. The Earl of Essex was moving from London, aware that the king was somewhere in the Midlands, and pitched his forces around the village of Kinnerton. Neither army was aware of the other until the evening. This marks the spot where the king stayed on the night before the battle. A commanding view of the battlefield, with Stratford-on-Avon off to the left, Banbury off to the right, and there in the valley you can see the village of Kinnerton, and underneath the escarpment, hidden from view, is the village of Radway. In fact, Edgehill is such a powerful position that King Charles moved his army down to the valley and deployed around Radway village, so that the Parliamentary army would give battle. Essex had the Parliamentary army move out to form up in front of Kinnerton village. And the field is set. The army of both sides was largely made up of infantry, and both sides had pikemen with 16-foot pikes, which were either used to ward off the cavalry or could be used like the ancient Greek phalanx, with a push of pike where two lots of pikemen scrummed together. Both armies also have musketeers. Most of the musketeers fired their muskets using a matchlock, a burning piece of cord which was touched into the touch hole of the gun to fire off the gunpowder charge, although even at this time some musketeers carried flintlock or firelock muskets, where the trigger was depressed to cause a hammer to strike the flint onto a frizzen plate and the spark to go into the touch hole and discharge the weapon. Matchlocks were very difficult during the rain, but flintlocks were also very delicate and were prone to breakage and misfire. Both sides also had the cavalry, but not many of them were armoured in the way that this picture shows. This is a picture of some Lobsters, or Cuirassiers, who had an interesting way of fighting the enemy infantry. They would ride upon their horses and discharge their pistols into the enemy infantry, and then retire with a complex series of manoeuvres to the rear of the column, so that the next group in front could also fire their pistols. This was called the caracole. If the battle was very stable, the caracole could be delivered from the flank, where the front rank of horses rode across the enemy's front, fired their pistols, and then retired to the rear. The next front rank would then complete the same manoeuvre, giving a steady volley of fire into the enemy infantry, although this form of the caracole was probably reserved for the parade ground and hardly ever happened in a real battle. Most of the cavalry will be equipped as medium cavalry, with at best a helmet, breastplate, and buff coat, with perhaps a gauntlet to protect their left arm. Cuirassiers, Lobsters, Ironsides, and Dragoons formed most of the cavalry of the English Civil War. The medium cavalry at the time of Edgehill was a pretty motley group, gathered together by anyone who could afford to keep a horse and could put together a reasonable piece of weaponry. The light dragoons were in fact infantry that went into battle on horses, then dismounted to fight on foot. Later dragoons would become light cavalry and would fight from their horses, but at this time the dragoons were definitely horse-mounted infantry. There was also artillery on both sides, with field artillery including larger cannons, smaller guns, and field mortars, which were able to throw primitive explosive shells. So, let's take a look at the battlefield. It's nicely matched between Radway and Kinnerton. The first on the battlefield were the Parliamentary cavalry, and they were able to watch the Royalist army coming down from Edgehill to surround the village of Radway. Wentworth, Fielding, Gerard, Byron, and Belleistyle all formed up around Radway village. It wasn't long before the Parliamentary infantry were forming up on their side of the line. And then Prince Rupert came onto the right wing of the Royalist forces, joined by Byron and some of the pensioners, and Usher's dragoons. The right wing of the Parliamentary forces were led by Fielding, who put his cavalry into a stand of woodland called the Oaks, and this meant that Wilmot and Digby on the Royalist side never really knew how much cavalry was facing them. Before the battle started, the parties of Royalist and Parliamentary captains met in the middle of the battlefield to decide how the battle would be fought, what time it would begin, and what rules it would cover. With the preliminaries over, Rupert charged his cavalry into the Parliamentaries' left wing, driving it from the field and going on to savage the baggage train. The infantry then joined together to fight the battle, which was soon covered by the fog of war. Fielding then drove his cavalry into the Royalist left wing and drove them from the field. Fairfax went in to support the infantry in the fog of war, and Usher's dragoons left to try and find Prince Rupert. Fielding pulled back to reform his ranks and wait for the smoke to clear. When it did, it was obvious that the two sides had fought to a standstill and the battle was more or less a draw. Fielding retired to reform his ranks, and the armies withdrew from the battlefield. And Prince Rupert returned to find that the battle was all over. It is often said that if he had better control of his cavalry, the battle would be won by the king, and the English Civil War would be over before it had really begun. But this is unfair on Rupert, who was a cavalry commander after the style of the 30 Years' War, where cavalry smashed the opposite wing, drove it from the field in rout, and then went to plunder the baggage train. So peace returns to Edgehill. After Edgehill, both sides vacillated and delayed. Essex pulled out towards the northeast, then made a dash for London to protect Parliament. The king fell back onto Oxford and then came down the Thames Vale, picking off Aylesbury, Brentford and Kingston as he came. The two armies then met at Turnham Green, and the king retreats without battle. With Parliament holding London and the king establishing his government at Oxford, the country divided more or less to the east and west. But over the next 3 years, the map would change considerably. Eventually, the king would hold Newark, Oxford, parts of Wales, and parts of Scotland. He surrendered to the Scots at Kelham near Newark, but that did not end the war. Newark-upon-Trent now deservedly houses the National Civil War Centre. Visit the centre and follow the town's history trail to learn about the terror and the glory that comes from civil war. That's our first programme for Muscombe History Group channel. Hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye for now.